Welcome to ES Media Channel, a place where darkness and mystery come together in every story. Prepare yourself for a thrilling journey, because tonight we will enter a world full of horror. Remember, don't get too close to the shadows, because who knows, there's something lurking in them. Are you ready? Let the story begin. At the edge of a village forgotten by time, stood an old house. The house was large, with rotting wooden walls and broken windows. No one dared to approach the house after dusk. The villagers considered the house cursed, a place inhabited only by dark memories and entities invisible to the human. For years, the house was left empty, locked tightly like a secret that could never be revealed. However, one night, a young woman named Sarah decided to challenge the fear that shackled her village. She was a writer looking for inspiration. Sarah had heard stories about the house since she was a child, but she did not believe in ghosts or curses. To her, the house was just an old building filled with interesting history to be explored. So, when night fell, and the fog began to cover the village, Sarah walked towards the house with courage. As she approached the front door of the house, the air around her felt heavier. The sky above her seemed darker than usual, and the once gentle wind was now blowing cold, like the whisper of death. The large, old wooden door stood before her, unmoving. Sarah took out the key she had found under a piece of wood beside the house, as the villagers had told her. She inserted it into the lock, and with a faint click, the door swung open by itself. Behind the door, there was only darkness. No light came in, even though the moon was shining brightly outside. Sarah stood in the doorway, feeling a strange aura emanating from the house. However, her curiosity was stronger than her fear. She stepped inside. As soon as she passed through the door, it slammed shut with a loud thud, making Sarah flinch. Inside the house, the air felt colder, and there was a strong, damp smell, like something that had been buried for a long time and had just been resurrected. Sarah took a flashlight from her bag and turned it on, illuminating the room in front of her. The room was large, filled with ancient furniture covered in thick dust. There was a wooden staircase at the end of the room that led to the second floor, but Sarah's first step took her into the living room on the left. The living room was filled with old mirrors, hanging on every wall. They were large, with carved wooden frames that were dusty and faded. In the middle of the room, an old rocking chair faced a window, which was cracked and covered in cobwebs. Sarah felt a strange chill as she stepped closer to the mirrors. She looked into one of them, and even though the room was empty, she felt as if something was peering at her from behind her own reflection. As Sarah stepped closer to one of the mirrors, she noticed something strange. Her reflection in the mirror did not move with her. She moved her hand slowly, but the reflection did not follow. Instead, it stood still, staring directly at her with dark, empty eyes. Sarah felt her heartbeat increase. She tried to step back, but the reflection in the mirror moved forward. Now, she no longer felt alone. Without warning, the reflection disappeared from the mirror, and Sarah felt something cold touch her neck. She turned quickly, but there was no one behind her. Her breath caught, and she realized that something in the house did not want her there. She had to get out, but as she turned toward the exit, the mirrors around her began to shake. The sound of wood creaking echoed through the house, and the rocking chair began to move slowly, even though there was no wind in the room. With terror gripping her heart, Sarah ran out of the living room. She headed for the stairs and up to the second floor, hoping to find another way out. But when she reached the top of the stairs, she stopped. At the end of the long hallway, there was a door that was slightly ajar. Through the crack of the door, Sarah saw a dim light shining out. But there was something wrong with the light. It was a dark red, like a slow-burning fire. Sarah felt as if something was calling her from behind the door. Her footsteps were soft, almost silent, as she approached the door. Each step felt heavy, as if a force was trying to pull her back. But Sarah kept walking. When she reached the door, she placed her hand on the cold doorknob and slowly pushed it open. Behind the door was an old bedroom. The bed was large and covered in faded silk. Next to the bed was a dressing table with a mirror that was larger than the one downstairs. But this time, there was no strange reflection in the mirror. All that was there was the reflection of the empty room behind it. Sarah walked closer, fear and curiosity competing within her. As she stood in front of the mirror, a soft voice suddenly reached her ears. "Don't look back." The voice was cold, as if it came from a different world. Sarah stood frozen. Her heart was pounding, and cold sweat began to freeze her face. She didn't dare move. Her body felt still, as if there was a force holding her in. Don't look back. The voice came again, this time clearer, closer. Sarah felt a presence behind her. A cold breath touched the back of her neck, making the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Slowly, despite her whole body wanting to resist, Sarah began to turn. But before she could fully see what was behind her, the cold hands gripped her shoulder. She screamed inward. No sound came out of her mouth. Her hands on her back. Sarah fell, back on the wooden floor. The flashlight she was carrying was blown and went out, leaving her in complete darkness. For a moment, she could only hear the sound of her own breathing ragged in the darkness. The hand was gone, but its presence was still lurking. She knew she was not alone. Sarah tried to crawl backwards, looking for a grip, but the wooden floor felt strange, as if it were moving beneath her fingers. She felt something slippery, and when she lifted her hand, she realized it was covered in blood. Blood was pouring from cracks in the floor, as if there was something buried beneath it, something badly wounded. Sarah tried to calm herself, though her body was shaking violently. "This is just a nightmare," she whispered to herself. "Hard to get out of here." With the last of her strength, she crawled towards the door, but when her hand reached the doorknob, it was locked shut. She shook it desperately, but it was no use. She was trapped. Behind her back, Sarah heard a soft sound, like someone laughing softly, but without emotion. The laughter echoed through the room, creating an echo that made the air grow colder. Sarah held her breath, afraid to make the slightest movement. She squeezed her eyes shut, hoping that when she opened them, everything would be gone. But the laughter grew louder, and now the footsteps were getting closer. The footsteps were slow, but each step felt like a hammer blow to her head. Sarah felt as if the room were closing in, and the air was getting harder to breathe. She tried to take a deep breath, but her lungs refused to cooperate. The footsteps were getting closer. She could feel it behind her now, something large and invisible, standing there, watching her with unseen eyes. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. An eerie silence fell over the room. Sarah opened her eyes slowly, and in the large mirror before her, she saw something terrible. Behind her, exactly where she had heard the footsteps, stood a blurry figure. Its face was indistinct, like the thick fog that had enveloped it, but its eyes, they glowed red, burning in the darkness. Sarah felt her body stiffen with fear. She wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The figure began to move closer, but not with ordinary steps. It glided, as if unbound by the laws of gravity. There were only a few feet between them, and Sarah knew she didn't have time. Desperately, she tried to open the door again, but it remained locked. The figure was now right behind her, and Sarah could feel the cold seeping into her skin. She didn't dare turn around again, but the figure whispered something in her ear. "You're mine now." The voice sounded sinister, full of menace. Sarah felt a cold touch on her neck. The touch slowly turned into a choke. Sarah tried to fight, tried to free herself, but the more she struggled, the tighter the grip became. Her breath became more laborious, and her vision began to blur. Everything began to fade, and just when she thought it was all over, the door in front of her swung open with a bang. Sarah fell to the floor, the fresh air saving her from the invisible choke. She tried to get up, her body shaking, but when she turned, the figure was gone. The room was now empty, except for the sound of the wind coming through the open door. Sarah ran out of the house without looking back. She ran as fast as she could down the path that led her back to the village. But even though she was far from the house, the feeling of terror still haunted her. Something from the house was still following her. She could feel it in the air around her, and the soft laughter still echoed in her. Sarah kept running, even as her body began to feel weak and her breath became shallow. The path that had been so clear in the moonlight was now covered by a thick fog. The trees around her looked like tall figures watching her, and every rustle of leaves sounded like an eerie whisper. She tried to convince herself that it was all just her imagination, that what she was feeling was just the effect of her fear. But the further she ran, the more she felt that something was following her. When Sarah finally reached the edge of the village, she was almost out of breath, but she felt a little relieved to see the lights of the houses. She hoped that someone was still awake, someone who could help her forget the nightmare she had just had. But as she walked further, she realized something was strange. The streets of the village were too quiet, too still. There were no animal sounds, no wind blowing, and all the house lights seemed to be out. She stepped more carefully, trying not to make a sound, though her heart was pounding so hard, it was almost audible. Suddenly, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something. Sarah turned to look, but there was nothing. The street was empty. She breathed a sigh of relief, if only for a moment, before the sound of soft footsteps sounded behind her. They were unhurried, like someone savoring every step. Sarah paused, her whole body tensing. She knew it couldn't be her imagination. The footsteps grew closer, clearer. Cautiously, Sarah turned back. But once again, the street was empty. There was no one there, but the footsteps were still there, as if they could be heard all over the room, bouncing off the shadows of the night. She tried not to panic, but her heart was pounding, and the feeling of dread was back over her. Without thinking, Sarah started running again. This time, she didn't care where her feet were taking her. She just wanted to get away, as far away as possible from the voice. The village streets had become an endless maze, and every step she took seemed to take her deeper into the darkness. At every turn, she could feel something lurking in the shadows. There was no way out. Finally, Sarah found herself in the middle of a small field surrounded by large trees. A thick fog blanketed the ground, making her feet feel heavy. In front of her, an old well stood, like a silent witness to a dark past. She couldn't remember ever seeing this place before, and she didn't know how she had gotten here. But something about the well caught her attention. Something was wrong. The well looked ordinary from a distance, but as Sarah approached, she saw something that made her blood run cold. On the edge of the well, there were handprints gripping the rock, like someone had tried to climb out of the well. The marks looked fresh, as if they had been made only hours ago. Sarah approached the well slowly, though her heart rebelled, begging her to back away. When she reached the edge of the well, she tried to peer inside. Inside the well, there was only deep darkness. No water, no reflection of moonlight. Just a pitch black that swallowed every light that came near. Sarah stood still, waiting for something to happen, but she didn't know what she was expecting. And suddenly, from within the darkness of the well, came a soft gurgling sound, like dripping water. The sound grew louder, deeper, until it became the sound of footsteps climbing up, rising from the darkness. Sarah stepped back quickly, almost falling, but she couldn't take her eyes off the well. The footsteps grew closer, louder, and finally, from within the well, a pale white hand emerged, gripping the edge. The hand was stiff, with long, trembling fingers. Then, slowly, a head emerged from the well, its face pale and covered in long, wet black hair. Sarah screamed and ran as fast as she could, away from the clearing. The footsteps chased after her, but she didn't dare turn around. She kept running, down a path that now seemed like it would never end. The darkness seemed to swallow her up, and at every turn, she could feel the gaze of the figure from the well chasing her. After running non-stop, Sarah finally arrived in front of a small house on the edge of the village. It was a house. She rushed inside, locking the door behind her. Her body was shaking, and she felt as if the entire village had turned into a dark and terrifying trap. She tried to calm herself down, but the laughter came again, clearer than before, as if it were right in her ear. "You can't run away," the voice whispered coldly. "I will always follow you." Sarah fell to the living room floor, her body losing strength. She knew that the entity from the old house would never let her go. Something dark and evil had bound itself to Sarah, and now she could not run away. The darkness would always be behind her, waiting for the right moment to claim her soul.